Hey, welcome to the channel. I keep coming across situations where I need a nice box joint jig so I can get nice, accurate cuts for box joints every time, but I don't have one. And I've seen some good videos on how to make them, so I wanted to combine some of those techniques and make something that is just mine, something a little bit different. And I was able to make this small, not very pretty, but very effective box joint jig for less than $8. Check it out. Since all the parts of this sled are going to be made out of 3/4 inch ply, I'll set my blade height first, and then I'm going to measure the distance between my two miter slots to make sure my sled's wide enough to go in between. I don't think the sled really needs to be any wider than that because of what we're doing with this. My crosscut sled is gigantic. It's about the same width as the entire surface of my table saw, but with this you're really just putting box joints on the ends of small boards when making boxes or drawers or things like that, so it didn't seem necessary to have anything bigger than I needed to store, so 12 inches seemed just fine. After getting the bottom cut, I'm cutting my front and back fences for the jig. Now, they don't really need to be any specific height, but they're providing support and keeping the two sides of your jig together after you cut your dado all the way through the bottom base plate of the jig. So you want them tall enough that they're going to keep everything together and keep everything nice and square and tight. So I went with about 4 inches, and you'll see later in the video I ended up actually recutting the back fence because with the back fence, you're using that to push it through the table saw, and you're also using it to support your workpiece, so I wanted it a little bit taller. After those are cut, it's on to cut my two runners, so I measure the width and depth of my miter slots, and then slowly move my fence in until I have a nice smooth but tight fit on both of those. And now I have all my pieces cut, and I am ready to assemble. Before assembly, I want to make sure the top of my table saw is all cleaned up. I don't want any of that dust getting in the way to mess up my glue up and make anything not quite square. I'm using pennies to space out the runners because you want them to sit just proud of the tabletop in your table saw so that they can have good contact with the bottom of the sled during the glue up. Because like I said before, you don't cut them deep enough so that they're actually hitting the bottom normally, but those pennies give you just enough space that you're making good contact with the bottom of your sled for this part. Use the fence to make sure everything's sitting just perfectly square, and then I'm using CA glue to get a quicker bond, and then wood glue in between to make sure everything is nice and strong and will last quite a while. Now I keep my tabletop nice and waxed, so I'm not too worried about getting a little bit of glue on there. It'll come right off with a little bit of mineral spirits, and then I'll add a little weight so that it is nice and firm and get a little bit of clamping pressure on those. Now you'll notice I made my runners way too long, and I put glue all the way to the end because I forgot that I cut my runners way too long. A little bit of a silly mistake, but it doesn't matter at this point. And then there's my mineral spirits to go ahead and clean up that tabletop. Just a little bit of glue slop that came out of there. And it comes right off with a little bit of mineral spirits. Next I'm going to clamp it down to my very temporary outfeed table so that I can cut those runners to proper length. And again, they don't have to be perfect. It's just a shop project. Actually on my crosscut sled I have them running a little bit long so that I can see the where they stick out so I can get them in the tracks a little quicker. But that sled's much bigger, so it just makes it easier for me. If you haven't used these Japanese pole saws, they're pretty awesome for quick cuts like this. Next I'm going to wax up the bottom so it slides smoothly across the tabletop back and forth. You could use if you're finishing furniture or anything like that, you want to use a nice lint-free rag and make sure the surface is clean. Again, wiping it off with mineral spirits, getting any sand or sawdust out of there ahead of time. For something like this though, I just use my hand, slap that stuff on there, rub it all over. I pretty much just use paste wax for tools, and I guess jigs are tools, so tools like this and my tabletops, planer bed, joiner in-feed and out-feed tables, so really doesn't need to be perfect, but still gets nice and smooth. I'll leave it on there to dry for a little bit, come back, wipe off any excess, and then I get a nice smooth finish after that. There wasn't too much excess, but you still don't want it getting on there and staying on there because it gets kind of, I don't know, tacky. You don't want that. It kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing. Go ahead and test it. Nice, smooth, across the tabletop. That's exactly what I want. Now I'm going to mark where my blade is going to run through. Of course, I'll be using a dado blade for that, so I marked it a little bit wide. I'll be using a 1/2 inch setup, so I didn't need to go too wide, but I just want to make sure I'm not putting a screw right in the way of where the blade's going to run through, because that would be quite a bit of a problem. Now I'm clamping my front face on. Now with the front face, you're never going to have any boards up against that when you're cutting, so it doesn't really need to be perfectly square, but since you cut your base square, as long as it's flush up against the edge of your base, it's going to be perfectly square, so you're good. And then I use a couple 18 gauge tacks just to hold it in place. I also have Tight Bond 1 in there to keep it nice and strong. I'm going to swap my combo blade out for my 1/2 inch dado stack and get that ready to go. Make my initial cuts through the bottom of the sled, and then before I get the final setup done. Now on this end, because this is my work end, I'm actually going to run some cabinet screws up through the bottom in addition to the glue. That way I have a little bit more support and strength at this end, since this is the end I'll actually be pushing everything through the saw with. Doesn't hurt to have a little bit extra strength. So I countersank with a Forstner bit, and now I'm running some pilot holes for those screws to go in nice and smoothly. Get all cleaned up, get all that sawdust out of there. And I'm using some GRK 2-inch cabinet screws. Alright, now it's back to the table saw with my dado stack installed. I'm going to slowly take passes, raising the blade a little bit on each pass, because I don't want to take too much material at a time, going 1/2 inch wide with this. Now I did notice, and I think I mentioned in the intro, my blades are a little bit dull, so I'm getting a little bit of tear out on this. It's not perfect, but it's still going to get the job done. I'm down to 2 cabinet screws to the bottom now, because the third one ended up being exactly where I didn't want it to be, where that blade was, because I measured on the wrong side, but that's okay, it's an easy fix, and 2's probably going to be plenty. I did decide, however, that the fence was just not quite tall enough for the back, the one I was actually going to use, so back over to the miter to cut a new rear fence, and fix it back up in position again with those screws. You can see now it's just a little bit taller, and if I'm working at the end of a workpiece for a box, for these box joints, I get a little bit more support now to make sure there's no wiggle in that board while I'm working with it. I grab a scrap piece of 3/4 inch ply out of the trash there to set my height. That was nicely conveniently placed in my trash can right beside my table saw. And then run it through one last time at the correct and final height. Alright, now I'm going to use my calipers to check the exact width. I know it's obviously the width of the dado stack I'll be using, but I want to make sure that I'm about to cut a piece where the box joints that have already been cut will sit in order to get the next pass lined up, as you'll see. So I back the screws out, because what I need to do is now move that piece over and run that piece through. And I'm going to leave that a little bit long for now, in case I need to trim part of it back down to a narrower width if the joint's too tight on that piece. So I'm going to leave it just like that for now until I make sure it's the correct width. I'll reattach my back. You notice I slid it over a 1/2 inch, well, a full inch to the left, because I need to offset where that piece is going to be holding the workpiece in place as I run it through the saw for the next section of the joint. And one thing worth mentioning real quick, any of the tools you see me use in the video today, I should have links in the description below. I'm going to try to find everything I can online, so that if there's something you want to try or you need in your shop, you can go ahead and find where I got it from and be able to purchase that for yourself and give it a shot. Alright, now to cut a couple pieces of ash that I had, some scrap laying around to test out the jig itself. Back over to the table saw with those pieces, and let's see how it works. Go nice and slow to try not to get too much tear out. Like I said, my blade's still pretty dull, so even on this test piece I ended up with some tear out. It was repairable with some wood filler, and after sanding it looked just fine. I wouldn't probably use that method on a client piece. I need to get my blade sharpened. I would also recommend that pilot hole that I put through the bottom of the jig itself, that should be no higher than the actual cuts you're going to make. With my crosscut sled, I did a pretty high original cut through because that way I'm not cutting through my sled every time I cut a thicker piece. With this, having that piece in place at the exact height I need it to be is going to prevent tear through or tear out. So I would recommend not going any higher than you absolutely need to. I mentioned in the closing that I should probably put a 1/4 inch piece of sacrificial ply behind the workpiece now, and that'll prevent that tear out in the future. But you can see it wasn't too bad. I'm trying to clean it up just a little bit. Run everything through one more time. And let's take a look at that. Pretty clean for a first run through. That's, like I said, it's going to look a whole lot better after I'm done sanding it. But I am pretty happy with how that turned out for an initial setup. I thought I'd have a lot more adjusting to do to get it dialed in. Now back over to my super awesome outfeed table to get everything sanded down. Just hitting it with 150 grit for now, just to kind of take off that tear out and get it cleaned up a little bit, just enough to glue. I'll be going back to the sanding after it's glued up. And then I grab the wood glue to get all those joints glued up and squeeze it together. I have my rag handy to clean up all that squeeze out, and then I'm going to do one clamp in each direction because it's a pretty simple joint, just a test joint for now, and I'm going to use it to, as you'll see in a little bit, mount a small security camera inside because I didn't want to just throw it away when I was done. So even though it's not the prettiest thing in the world, with a couple little scrap pieces of ash, I figured I'd still get some use out of it, so it'll still have life beyond this test. And with a little camera magic and editing, the time has passed that I could take it out of the clamps and take a look at how it turned out. You can see there's a teeny little bit of gaps in there, probably because I ran it through twice, just trying to get all that cleaned up. But overall, not too bad. So now it's time to add a little bit of wood filler using just natural color because ash is a pretty close to that natural color that is, I think, made for pine, but it works just great on ash. I've used it on white oak too, it's pretty close to that, and poplar. So just kind of smooth that into any of those little cracks and gaps, making sure it's just a little bit more cleaned up than without. I actually started to use my orbital sander to clean those up, and then I remembered that I had this tool I got recently, my spindle / belt sander, which went way quicker, and you can see it turned out pretty solid for a first attempt on these after cleaning them up on that sander. And then I'll go back to the orbital because there's some pretty aggressive grit paper on that spindle sander, so I'm just kind of cleaning that up with, starting with 150, and I hit it with 220 for a final grit on that. It is a little bit tricky using an orbital sander with a piece this small, but it worked out just fine. And my one complaint, you can see the sander's jumping around a little bit, my one complaint with that 3M Cubitron is that it has a really hard time staying perfectly in the center of my sander for whatever reason. So now I still have my dado stack set up. I ran the back side of this through to put a channel in the back. Like I said, it's going to be a camera mount, so I put that in the back so I could run the cord through it for the camera down to the outlet. And now I'm marking out, so I have 2 evenly spaced screw holes that I'm going to mount it to the wall with. So this doesn't have to be perfect. Again, it's just something for inside our house, just to throw up on the wall and serve a purpose instead of wasting the scrap wood. But I still want it to look pretty nice. So then I start with my Forstner bit to be able to not only countersink the screw, but also cover it up with a dowel after I'm done. So I use the Forstner bit. I think it was a 3/8 because I have a couple 3/8 dowels sitting around. Even though this is ash, I used poplar dowels and it was close enough for what I needed. So I get all that cleaned up, swap out my Forstner bit for a smaller bit to be able to do my pilot holes. And then I grab a scrap piece of that 3/4 ply that was my initial fence that I used, so I'm not drilling into my outfeed table. As perfect as it is, I don't want to mess it up any more than it has to be. So now I have pilot holes, I have them countersunk, and my 3/8 poplar dowel sits perfectly in there. And before I take all this inside to get it hung on the wall, I'm going to hit it with a little bit of teak oil, which was a struggle to get that cap off. I really don't like the style caps they put on those cans. But after I got that off, rubbed it down with some teak oil. I mostly use Danish oil, but I picked up some of this teak oil when not a single store around here had natural colored Danish oil. They had nothing but medium and dark walnut, which obviously adds quite a bit of stain to what I'm doing. I like the natural look because if I'm going to pick a certain species of wood, I like it to have that color for that wood. So I always go for natural. But I picked up this teak oil, hadn't used it yet, and I figured since it's not a client project, I might as well give that a try and see how it worked. And honestly, it's, as far as the looks go, it's about the same as the Danish oil. I believe you get a little less protection with it, but since what I'm doing with it is hanging on a wall in my daughter's room as a sort of a security / kids camera, I figured it wouldn't really need all that much protection. So after I figure out where I wanted it, don't mind the wall not being perfect back there, I ran the screws in, got it leveled, ran the second screw in. You can see that channel in the back working to hide that, let that cord run through. I had the good idea of adding the tape so that my saw wouldn't tear up the surface of this wood. That didn't work at all. The tape didn't want to stick because that teak oil was still quite fresh. I didn't wait for it to dry fully because the kids weren't going to be in there for a while anyway, so I wasn't worried about slight fumes. So I should have just skipped the tape because I was going to hit it with sandpaper anyway. But after the screws are in, I just kind of twist my dowel in and cut that back flush. Now you notice I didn't use any glue for the dowels. The reason behind that is it is mounted to the wall. So while I wanted to cover those screw holes and make it look nice, I did not want to have to remove the wall to get this off if we ever wanted to move it or when we want to move it. By not using glue, I just need a small drill bit to run into those dowels just a little bit and then pull them right out. That way, again, we can move it if we want to in the future. So while it's not perfect overall for $8, I think this jig turned out to be pretty useful. It needs to get dialed in a little bit better than it is right now, but that's something I can work on off camera. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter because if I'm going to do thinner stock, this isn't going to cut it. It's not going to sit down and seat properly. My dado stack needs sharpened for sure. I was definitely getting a little bit of tear out on my cuts. That's an easy fix. I also think if we're running into that in the future, putting a piece of 1/4-inch ply as a sacrificial fence inside here will prevent that tear out, so we wouldn't run into that in the future. If you'd have done something different than this, tell me what you think in the comments below. Subscribe to follow along with what else I'm going to come out with. Plan on doing some more build videos like this, some jigs, some furniture, a lot of different stuff. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.